For 9 years, a lumber mill in the Oregon foothills dumped truckloads of sawdust beside a homeless widow's tent. The foreman was certain the mess would drive her off the property. He was wrong. She stayed. She studied that sawdust. She failed with it through 9 cold winters alone, except for a stray dog and a folded flannel shirt that still smelled like her husband. Then one spring morning in 2024, a man in a gray suit walked down the muddy trail to her campsite and offered her $500,000 for what she had built with her own 2 arthritic hands. But the money is not the part of this story that people in Pinebrook still whisper about over coffee at the Ridgeway Diner. The part they whisper about is the sealed envelope, the one her husband pressed into her hand 14 months before he died, the one he told her not to open until she knew who she was again, the one she carried inside a cedar box for 9 long years. Through frozen nights and failed brick walls and the slow silent grief of becoming invisible to a town that had once known her name. This is the story of Marjorie Halstead, of the woman who was thrown away, of the sawdust that was meant to bury her, and of what she finally read on that folded piece of paper the day she stopped being invisible. You are going to want to hear this one all the way through. The muddy trail behind thorn lumber. Spring of 2024. The rain from the night before had turned everything to soft brown clay that pulled at the soles of your boots. And down that trail came a man in a gray suit. He did not belong there. Anyone could see it. His shoes were the kind of shoes people wear in offices. His briefcase was leather. His hair had been cut recently by someone who charged money for it. He walked slowly because the trail was slick and because he had never in his life walked toward a house like the one he was walking toward. At the end of the trail, under a big leaf maple, beside a creek that the locals called Sparrow, there stood a small house, not a shed, not a shack, a house, about 400 square feet, honey gray walls that seemed to hold the morning light inside them, cedar shingles on the roof, a covered porch, flower boxes spilling over with red nasturtiums. And on that porch, in the rocking chair her husband had built for her 22 years earlier, sat a woman, 54 years old, silver hair pulled back with a rubber band, a blue flannel shirt she had washed maybe 2,000 times, hands folded in her lap, arthritis in every knuckle, watching the man in the gray suit approach the way you watch weather come in over the ridge. Her name was Marjorie Halstead. Everyone called her Margie. The man reached the bottom step and stopped. He set down his briefcase. He looked up at her. "Mrs. Halstead," he said. "That's me," she said. "I've come a long way to see you." "I imagine you have." He opened the briefcase on the porch step. Inside was a folder, and inside the folder was a check, $500,000. He held it out to her with both hands, like a person handing over something breakable. And Margie did not reach for it. She looked at the check, then she looked at him. Then she looked down at her lap, at the pocket of her blue flannel shirt, where there was something in that pocket, something rectangular, something small, something she had been carrying for 9 years without opening. She closed her eyes for just a second, just long enough to feel the whole thing rise up in her chest. Everything. All 9 years. The tent, the winters, the sawdust, the soup cans, the dump, the failure, the library, the whispered voice she was almost sure was her husband's, the envelope. Everything. To understand how a woman ends up on a porch beside a lumber mill creek, holding $500,000 in one hand and a 9-year-old sealed letter in the other. You have to go back. You have to go back to a white farmhouse with a wraparound porch on a maple-lined street in a small Oregon timber town called Pinebrook. You have to go back to the year Marjorie Halstead lost everything, except one thing, but she didn't know it yet. Pinebrook, Oregon sits in the foothills of the Coast Range. 1,400 people, 1 mill, 1 church, 1 diner called the Ridgeway that opens at 5 in the morning for the men driving down to the logging roads. 1 elementary school where Marjorie Halstead had taught Sunday school for 18 years. She was 45 when it started. The year was 2014. The house was white with a wraparound porch. The garden out back grew tomatoes so large the neighbors joked about them. And every night at 6:30, give or take, a red Kenworth log truck would come up the driveway and Everett Halstead would come through the kitchen door, still smelling of diesel and pine sap. He would kiss her on the forehead. He would ask what was for dinner. He would take off his boots by the door because she had asked him to. Once, 22 years earlier, Everett was a quiet man, the kind who fixed things without being asked, the kind who saved his words for when they mattered. He was 6'2" and skinny and wore the same blue flannel shirt every Saturday for as long as Margie had known him, because she had given it to him on their first Christmas together, and because he was that kind of man. He had been coughing for almost a year before he told her. That was the part Margie kept coming back to. Later, in the tent, on the cold nights, in the years when she had nothing else to do but think. He had been coughing, and she had noticed, and she had asked, and he had said it was nothing, and she had let him say it was nothing, because he was Everett, and Everett did not lie, and Everett did not exaggerate, and Everett had never been sick a day in his life, except that he was. By the time he finally drove himself to the county hospital in Corvallis, on a Tuesday morning in September, without telling her, the cancer was in his lungs, and his liver, and his spine. The doctor did not use the word months. He used the word fight. Everett fought for 14 of them. Margie sat beside his hospital bed for every one of them. She read to him from a paperback Western he had loved as a young man. She held a plastic cup of ice chips to his lips. She learned the names of medications she had never heard of. She learned how to change a bandage. She learned how to change a diaper. She learned how to lie to a man she loved when he asked her if he looked worse today than yesterday. He did. He always did. On a Thursday afternoon in October of 2015, 14 months after the diagnosis, Everett Halstead pulled his wife closer to the hospital bed with a strength she did not know he still had, and he pressed something into her hand, a sealed envelope, plain white, about the size of a birthday card, her name written on the front in his handwriting, which had gotten shakier and shakier over the last month, but which was still his, unmistakably his. "Ev," she said, "take it." "Ev, what is this?" "Don't open it." "Ev." "Not now, not tomorrow, not next year." "When?" He looked at her. His eyes were still his eyes, even at the end, steady, gray-blue, kind. "Open it," he said, "when you know who you are again." "I know who I am, Ev. I'm your wife." He shook his head. "Just barely. Just enough." "Not enough," he whispered. She did not understand. She would not understand for a very long time. He died the next morning, just after sunrise, holding her hand. She was 46 years old. She put the envelope inside the pocket of his blue flannel Saturday shirt. She folded the shirt carefully. She placed the shirt inside a small cedar box he had built for her on their 10th anniversary. She closed the lid. She did not open the box again for 9 years. The bills came fast. That was the part nobody warns you about. When a man like Everett dies, slowly, in a hospital, with a body that needs machines and needles and pills and beds and nurses and specialists and second opinions and third opinions. The bills come fast, $180,000. That was the number at the bottom of the last statement Margie opened, sitting at the kitchen table in the white farmhouse, 2 months after Everett was buried. She read it 3 times because she thought she was reading it wrong. She was not reading it wrong. The insurance company had a lawyer. Margie did not have a lawyer. The insurance company had a system. Margie did not have a system. The insurance company said that a treatment Everett had received in month 9 was experimental, which meant it was not covered, which meant the hospital was owed $41,000, which was on top of the deductible, which was on top of the co-insurance, which was on top of the medications. Margie called them. Margie wrote them. Margie drove 90 minutes to Corvallis and sat in a beige office and cried in front of a woman with a name tag who was very sorry there was nothing she could do. The bank was less patient than the insurance company. The bank had a schedule. By June of 2016, 8 months after Everett was in the ground, the white farmhouse with the wraparound porch belonged to someone else. Margie stood in the empty living room, holding a cardboard box that contained her wedding album and her mother's china in Everett's cedar box. And she looked at the wallpaper her husband had helped her hang in 1994, and she said out loud, to nobody, "I don't know what to do." Nobody answered her. She slept in the pickup truck for 6 weeks. The Walmart parking lot, then the gravel lot behind the feed store, then the shoulder of a logging road nobody used anymore because the timber lease had run out. She was 46 years old. She had a widow's pension that came to $1,100 a month, which was not enough to rent an apartment in Pinebrook, which had no apartments anyway. She had 2 hands. That hurt when she made a fist because of the arthritis her mother had also had, and her mother's mother. She had no children. She and Everett had wanted them. It had not happened, and they had made a life anyway. And it had been enough. For 22 years, it had been enough, and she had a cedar box. She kept the cedar box on the passenger seat of the truck, under a folded quilt where nobody could see it through the window if they walked by. She could not bring herself to knock on a single door in Pinebrook. Not the church, because Mrs. Whitcomb was on the deacon board, and Mrs. Whitcomb had been her closest friend for 20 years. And Margie could not stand the thought of Mrs. Whitcomb opening her front door and seeing what Margie had become. Not the diner, because Delia Monroe cooked there. And Delia had loved Everett like a brother. And Margie could not bear pity from a woman who had once bought Everett a birthday pie. Not the school, because she had taught half of those parents in Sunday school when they were children. And how do you look a former student in the face and ask them for a couch to sleep on? You don't. If you are Marjorie Halstead, you do not. So in the late summer of 2016, 14 months after her husband died, Margie drove her failing pickup truck down an old logging road behind Thorn Lumber, where the alder saplings had grown over the ruts, and where nobody had walked in maybe a decade. She parked the truck, she got out, she followed the sound of running water, and she came out onto a flat patch of ground beside a creek called Sparrow, under a big leaf maple whose branches spread out over the water like a green cathedral roof. Nobody was there. Nobody had been there in a long time. The ground was soft. There was a natural windbreak of blackberry canes. The creek ran clear and cold, and from the mill up the hill you could just barely hear the whine of a saw, which meant there were people, which meant she was not truly alone. But nobody would see her here, which was the point. She pitched a small green nylon tent. She arranged river stones into a fire ring. She set the cedar box inside the tent, under the folded quilt. She sat on a log and she watched the water go by. She told herself it was temporary. It would be her home for the next 7 years. The first months were the quiet months. Nobody at the mill noticed her. She kept the fire small and only at night. She walked into Pinebrook twice a week for day work, washing dishes at the Ridgeway on Saturday mornings before dawn, cleaning the pastor's house on Wednesday afternoons when he was out visiting the shut-ins. She kept her hair braided and her clothes clean and her eyes down. She was invisible, which was almost tolerable, because if nobody sees you, nobody has to know, except that she saw them. That was the part that hurt. One Tuesday in September of 2016, she walked into the Pinebrook grocery to buy a loaf of bread because she had $1.90 in her pocket, and bread was $1.79. She was in the bread aisle, reaching for the store brand, when she looked up, and Mrs. Whitcomb was at the end of the aisle. 20 years of friendship, 20 years of casseroles carried across the church parking lot, 20 years of hymnals shared in the same pew, 20 years of Christmas cards signed with both of their names. Mrs. Whitcomb saw her, their eyes met, and then Mrs. Whitcomb turned her head, slowly, deliberately, toward a display of canned peaches, and she pretended to read the price tag for a very long time, until Margie had paid, and walked out, and crossed the parking lot, and gotten into her truck. Only then did Margie see Mrs. Whitcomb come out of the store, get into her Buick, and drive away. Margie sat in the truck for 22 minutes without starting the engine. She was not crying, she was not angry, she was something else, something she did not have a word for. She was gone. That was the closest word. She was gone, and Mrs. Whitcomb had helped her be gone. And now that she was gone, she would not be coming back. She drove back to the creek. She sat on the log by the water. She looked into the cedar box for the first time in a year. She looked at the folded blue flannel shirt. She did not open the envelope, because Everett had told her not to, because she did not know who she was, because Marjorie Halstead was gone. And a woman she did not yet recognize was sitting on a log by a creek in her place. The foreman of Thorn Lumber in the fall of 2016 was a 58-year-old heavy-set man named Wendell Brogan. Wendell was not a cruel man. He was a tired man, which is different. He had worked at Thorn Lumber since he was 19. He had married a woman named Loretta, who left him 3 years earlier because he had grown quiet and bitter and impossible to talk to across the supper table. He lived alone in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of Pinebrook. He watched a lot of television. He drank a moderate amount of beer. He was not proud of any of it. He was tired, and a tired man does not make good decisions. In October of 2016, one of Wendell's drivers reported smoke coming from behind the log decks by the creek. Wendell walked down the trail himself, because that was his job. He came out onto the flat patch by the water, and there was a green tent, and a fire ring, and a small woman in a blue flannel shirt sitting on a log, braiding her hair. She looked up when she saw him. She did not stand up. She did not look afraid. She looked at him the way a person looks at weather. "Ma'am," Wendell said. "Mr. Brogan," she said. He was surprised she knew his name. Pinebrook was small, but he did not remember her. "You can't be here," he said. "I know. This is mill property." "I know that too." "You'll have to move on." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, in a voice as steady as the creek behind her, "Where?" Wendell did not have an answer. Because he was tired, and he had not thought this through, And a homeless widow on company land was not a problem he had a form for. And calling the sheriff meant paperwork. And paperwork meant the newspaper. And the newspaper meant his name printed under a photograph of a woman with braided hair being escorted off a lumber mill lot in Pinebrook, Oregon. He walked back up the trail without saying another word. He sat at his desk for 2 hours. And then he came up with what he thought was a smarter plan. Thorn Lumber produced roughly 6 tons of sawdust and planer shavings every single week. Hauling it to the county disposal site cost the company about $400 a load. Old man Alden Thorn, the owner, who was 81 and dying and cared about nothing but his azaleas, would not miss the small savings if Wendell diverted a load or two. Wendell called in his 3 drivers. He told them the new plan. Dump the sawdust loads on the flat patch beside the creek, about 40 feet from the tent. Why? Asked the youngest driver, a 24-year-old named Emmett Farkas. Because, said Wendell, in a month, she'll get tired of it, and she'll leave, and nobody has to fill out any paperwork, and nobody has to call the sheriff, and nobody has to look bad. Emmett Farkas did not like it, but Emmett Farkas needed his job. He climbed into the cab of the first dump truck the next morning. The first truck came on a Wednesday, November 2nd, 2016. The sky was the color of a wet stone. The temperature was hovering just above freezing. Margie was inside her tent, sorting a pile of dry alder leaves she had gathered to use as tinder. When she heard the diesel engine coming down the logging road, she stepped out of the tent. She watched the truck back up, slowly, carefully, till it was about 40 feet from her camp. She watched the bed of the truck tilt up. She watched a small mountain of fresh Douglas fir sawdust pour out onto the ground, steaming faintly in the cold air. Golden, fragrant, enormous. The driver did not look at her, not once. He got out of the cab. He walked around the truck. He wiped his hands on a rag. He climbed back in. He drove away. Margie stood there for a long time. She understood exactly what was happening. She was not stupid. Wendell Brogan wanted her gone, and Wendell Brogan had decided that dumping ugliness on her doorstep would do the trick. She stood at the edge of that pile, and she felt something rise up in her chest that surprised her. It was not despair. It was not humiliation. It was almost a laugh, because she thought, very clearly, in Everett's voice, not her own. She thought, a load never gets lighter by staring at it. That was one of Everett's sayings. He had said it 100 times. On job sites, on the porch, in the truck. Whenever a stack of firewood needed splitting. Whenever a bill needed paying. She looked at the sawdust. She looked up at the sky. She said, out loud, to nobody, all right, Ev. That night, the temperature dropped to 21 degrees Fahrenheit, which is very cold, for a woman sleeping under a nylon tent, with 2 wool blankets, and a small fire dying in a stone ring outside the door. Margie lay in the tent with her teeth chattering, her breath rising white above her face, her hands tucked into her armpits because her fingers had gone numb. And she thought about the pile, the enormous, warm-smelling, Douglas fir sawdust pile, sitting 40 feet from her tent, in the dark. She got up. She put on Everett's blue flannel shirt over her sweater. She put on his old barn coat over that. She took her flashlight and her 5-gallon bucket. She walked outside. The pile was still faintly steaming. Sawdust is warm, fresh sawdust, from the mill, piled deep, traps heat inside it as the wood particles break down. It releases warmth slowly, for hours, for a whole night, like a slow-burning stove without a flame. Margie did not know any of this yet, not the science, not the words. She only knew that when she reached her hand into the pile, up to the wrist, her fingers came out warm. She started shoveling, bucket after bucket, back to the tent, where she packed the sawdust in a thick skirt around the base of the canvas. A foot deep, all the way around. She banked it higher on the windward side. She pushed it up against the door flap. She even mounted it a little on the roof. By 2 in the morning, she was covered in dust and sweat. Her hair had come out of its braid. Her arthritis was screaming. She crawled inside the tent. She lay down. She waited. 10 minutes later, she was warm, truly warm, for the first time since she had lost the White House. She lay in the dark, inside a tent packed in the sawdust that had been dumped there to punish her. And she started to laugh, quietly at first, then not so quietly. It was a strange laugh, half a sob, half a wheeze, coming out of a woman who had not laughed in 18 months. She laughed because she was warm and because the man who had wanted her cold had accidentally kept her from freezing to death. And she thought, very clearly, in her own voice this time, He's going to keep dumping, isn't he? He was. Wendell Brogan sent a truck 3 times a week, all that winter, and all through 2017, and every year after that, because he did not know how to stop, and because he had convinced himself it was working. Any week now, she would break. Any week now, she would pack up and go. She did not. She used every load. She packed sawdust around the tent all winter and stayed warm through nights that killed pipes in houses all over Pinebrook. She learned that if you pack sawdust tight into an empty tomato soup can with a wick of twisted rag, you had a candle that burned for 4 hours. She learned that if you spread sawdust over the mud in the rainy months, the path from the tent to the creek stopped being a slick disaster. She learned that if you mixed sawdust into the poor gravelly soil beside the creek, the little vegetable patch she planted the following spring came up bigger than she expected. What had been an insult became a supply line, which was the first small miracle. The second one was still waiting, down the trail in the summer of 2017. She had been living beside Sparrow Creek for over a year by then. She was 47 years old. Her hair was more silver than brown now. On a hot Saturday in late July, she was digging clay. The banks of Sparrow Creek in that particular bend were made of heavy gray clay. She had noticed it that spring. She had thought, maybe it would work as a liner for her fire pit, because her fire pit had a habit of losing heat down into the loose sandy soil underneath. She had a rusted trowel she had found in the mill dump. She had a 5-gallon bucket. She was chest deep in the creek, in her rolled-up work pants, scraping wet gray clay off the bank in slippery handfuls, dropping it into the bucket. The bucket was almost full. She climbed out of the water. She carried the bucket up the slope toward the fire ring, which was next to a flat river stone, where she had laid out a pan of sawdust to dry in the sun, because dry sawdust burned better in her soup can candles than damp sawdust did. Her boots were wet. The slope was steep. She slipped. The bucket tilted. She grabbed for it. She missed. And a solid 2 gallons of wet gray clay slurry slopped out sideways, directly onto the drying pan of sawdust. Margie stood there, muddy, wet, out of breath, and she looked at the ruined pan. She was tired and she was hungry, and it had taken her 40 minutes to dig that clay, and she wanted to sit down. But she did not sit down, because she was Marjorie Halstead, and Marjorie Halstead cleaned up messes. She reached down, she scooped up a big handful of the ruined mess, wet gray clay and damp sawdust. She squeezed it in her fist, but something stopped her. The handful in her fist felt interesting. The clay held the sawdust the way mortar holds bricks. The sawdust bulked out the clay, made it lighter, less sticky. The two things together, wet gray goo and golden wood particles, formed something in her palm that felt more like putty than like mud. She stood there for a long time, squeezing the handful. She was thinking, absently, about her grandmother, who had made adobe patches for the outdoor bread oven at the family farm in the Willamette Valley when Margie was a little girl, and how her grandmother had said that the best patches were the ones where you mix the clay with a little of something else. Straw, chaff, hair from the barn floor, anything that would give the clay something to hold on to. Wood particles would give clay something to hold on to, wouldn't they? She slapped the handful down onto the flat river stone. She pressed it flat with her palm. She shaped it into a rough rectangle, about the size of a small loaf of bread. She smoothed the edges with her thumb. She stepped back. It looked ridiculous. A lumpy gray and tan brick, sitting on a rock. She almost picked it up and threw it in the fire, but she did not, because it was Saturday, and she was tired, and it was hot, and the sun was strong, and the flat stone was warm from the July sun, and she thought, if it is still there tomorrow, I will decide what to do with it tomorrow. She left it on the stone. 3 days later, Tuesday morning, after she had come back from the diner, she saw the brick on the rock. She had forgotten about it. She walked over. She bent down. She picked it up. It was light, lighter than she expected. She turned it over in her hands. The surface was hard, dry, warm from the sun. She rapped it against the side of the fire ring. It did not crumble. She walked over to a larger boulder at the edge of the water. She wound up. She threw the brick against the boulder as hard as her arthritic shoulder would let her. The brick bounced off, landed in the shallows, rolled twice, came to a stop. It did not break. She waded into the creek. She picked it up. There was a chip on one corner, about the size of her thumbnail. That was all. Margie stood in the cold water of Sparrow Creek, barefoot, in her wet work pants, holding a small gray and tan brick made out of clay and sawdust in pure stupid accident, and she felt something rise up in her chest. Something that had not risen up in her chest in the 2 years. something that felt like a door opening. Just a crack, just enough to let a little light in. And in that crack, in that thin sliver of light, she heard a voice she had not let herself hear since October of 2015, in a hospital room in Corvallis. Everett's voice, very quiet, very close, very calm. Margie, she stopped breathing. If you can make one, you can make 1,000. She stood in the water. She did not move. She did not answer him. She just stood there, holding a lumpy little brick in a creek behind a lumber mill. And she thought very slowly, very carefully. 1,000 of these would be a wall, and 2 walls would be a room, and 4 walls would be a house, and a house would be something, something she could not yet name. She walked back to the shore. She set the brick down on the flat river stone. Very gently, as if it were a living thing, she walked to the tent. She lifted the folded quilt on the cot. She opened the cedar box. She looked at the folded blue flannel shirt. She saw the corner of the envelope in the pocket. She did not open the envelope. She was not ready. She did not know who she was yet. But for the first time in 2 years, she thought, that maybe someday she might be. She sat down on her log. She looked at the little brick on the stone. She said, out loud, to nobody, and to Everett, and to herself, all right. The sun was setting behind the ridge. The light on the water was gold. Sparrows were making their evening noise in the alders, and a small woman in a blue flannel shirt was sitting on a log by a creek, beside it a lumpy little brick that had no business existing. That was July of 2017. She had 6 years and 8 months to go. She did not know that yet either. What she knew was that maybe, just maybe, the pile of insult in the corner of her camp was not an insult anymore. Maybe it was a gift. Maybe it had been a gift the whole time. The first wall failed in 7 weeks. That was the fall of 2017. Margie had spent the last of the good summer weather making bricks. Not 1 brick, not 10, 64 bricks, lined up along the flat river stone, numbered with a nail scratch on the bottom corner, 1 through 64. She built a low garden wall along the north side of her vegetable patch. Just a test, 2 feet high, 6 feet long, 2 courses deep. She stood back when it was finished. She almost cried because it was a wall, a real wall, standing on the ground, made by her hands. She patted the top of it with her palm. She said, out loud, look at that, Ev. The first serious rain of the Pacific Northwest fall came the 2nd week of October. It rained for 9 straight days, not a storm, a slow, patient, drenching rain, the kind that seeps into everything. On the 5th morning, Margie came out of the tent to check on the wall. The wall was gone. Not knocked down, not broken, gone. It had dissolved, slumped into a long, low ridge of gray porridge along the north side of the vegetable patch, as if a child had built it out of wet sand at the beach. Margie stood in the rain in her barn coat and looked at the porridge. She did not say anything. She walked back to the tent. She sat inside for a long time. The second attempt took the entire following summer. She read at the library. Not much yet. She was still shy of asking for help. She used the encyclopedias. She looked at old library books about adobe houses in the American Southwest. She wrote down the words she did not know. She learned a word. Stabilization. Adobe bricks. The real kind. That had lasted 500 years in New Mexico, were stabilized with something, sometimes lime, sometimes chopped straw, sometimes horse manure, sometimes ash from the fire. She had ash. She had plenty of ash from 2 years of campfires. She built a second batch, 240 bricks, mixed with wood ash, cured slow under damp cloth this time. She built a small storage hut in the summer of 2018, 6 feet by 6 feet, chest high, a little peaked roof of salvaged tin. She put her extra blankets in it, her spare boots, a tarp, a tin of matches. 2 months later, she opened the door of the little hut, and a wall of black mold came up at her face. Black, fuzzy, alive. She staggered back. The clay had held the wall together fine, but the sawdust inside the bricks, damp all summer under the tin roof, had grown mold, deep, all the way through the material. She tore the hut down herself, brick by moldy brick. She burned the pallet door. She burned the blankets. She burned the tarp. She kept the tin roof because you keep tin roofs. If you are Marjorie Halstead, you keep tin roofs. The third attempt cracked apart in a February freeze. That was 2019. She had done everything right. She had added ash for stabilization. She had cured the bricks under a canvas tarp. She had built the wall in a sheltered spot behind the tent. She had gotten 3 courses up, 4 feet by 6 feet. She had planned it as the beginning of a real structure. The February cold came in from the coast that year. 12 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 nights in a row, which was almost unheard of at that elevation, which meant ice, which meant water, which had got inside the bricks, which expanded. She heard it on the second night, a sound like a rifle crack in the dark. Then another, then another. She lay in the tent and listened to her third year of work, splitting itself apart. In the dark. In the morning she went out. The wall stood, barely. But every brick had a spidery white crack running through it. Some had crumbled at the corners. Some had split down the middle. One had fallen off in the night and was lying in 3 pieces on the frozen ground. Margie sat down on an overturned bucket in the sleet that was starting to fall, and she looked at the wall, and she did not move. For a long time, she sat there, 49 years old, her joints screaming, her nose running, sleet in her hair, and she thought very clearly, I can't do this. I can't. I am too tired. I am too alone. She put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She had not cried in over 3 years. Since 2 nights after Everett was buried, she was not sure anymore that she could. She just sat. The sleet kept falling, somewhere up the hill. A saw at the mill started up, because it was Monday, and Monday meant work, even if a woman was sitting on a bucket in the sleet, watching her life fall apart. Bomb. For the third time in a row. She sat there until the sun set. The next morning she got up, and she started sorting. Bricks that had cracked all the way through, into a pile on the left. Bricks that had only cracked on the surface, into a pile in the middle. Bricks that were still whole, into a pile on the right. By noon she had 3 piles. The pile on the right had 41 bricks in it. 41 bricks out of 280 that had survived the freeze. She sat down beside the pile on the right. She picked up 1 brick. She turned it over. She looked at the number scratched on the bottom. 81. She picked up another one. 114, another, 47. She stared at the numbers, and she thought, what did these have in common? And that was the day that Marjorie Halstead, widow of Everett Halstead, 49 years old and arthritic and half frozen, started keeping her notebooks. The librarian at the Pinebrook Public Library was a young woman named Iris Kellner. Iris was 26 years old that spring. She had moved to Pinebrook 3 years earlier from a suburb east of Seattle because the library had needed a new head librarian. And because a small town in Oregon was as far as she could get from the life she was trying to leave behind. Iris wore her hair in a long, dark braid over her shoulder. She had a chipped front tooth she was self-conscious about. She did not smile easily, which meant when she did smile, you noticed. She had noticed the older woman in the blue flannel shirt before. She had noticed her come in once every 2 weeks. Since 2016, always Wednesdays, always around 11 in the morning, always going to the same shelf. Reference, second floor, building trades and home economics. Iris had never spoken to her because Iris had a rule. Iris's rule was, you do not ask a person what their story is. But she watched. She watched the older woman come in with a small notebook and take a pencil out of the front pocket of her flannel shirt and sit at the reading table by the north window and write for 2 hours, then put the books back exactly where she had found them and leave. She watched the older woman get thinner every winter and thicker every summer. She watched her hands, the way she braced her wrist against the table when she wrote, because the pencil hurt her fingers. Iris did not know her name until one Wednesday in March of 2019, 3 weeks after the February freeze. The older woman came in, went to her shelf, came back with 3 books, sat at the reading table, opened her notebook, took out her pencil, and sat there for 20 minutes, not writing, not reading, just looking at the books. Iris watched from the front desk. After 20 minutes, Iris got up, she walked over, she sat down in the chair across from the older woman, very quietly. The older woman looked up. Iris looked at the 3 books on the table. She read the spines, upside down, the way librarians do. Modern Adobe construction, cement and its uses, sustainable building materials in the American Southwest. Iris did not say, are you homeless? Iris did not say, what are you doing? Iris did not say, can I help you? Iris said one thing, very simple, very quiet. What are you looking into? That was the sentence. The one Marjorie Halstead had not been asked by any human being. In 3 years and 4 months, Margie opened her mouth to answer, and nothing came out. She closed it. She looked down at the notebook. She looked back up at Iris, and she said, in a voice that surprised her with how rough it was, I'm trying to build a wall. Iris nodded very seriously, as if this were a completely normal answer. What kind of wall? Iris said. A wall that doesn't fall down. Iris nodded again. Where does it keep falling down? She said. Margie stared at her because it was such a simple question, and nobody had ever asked her a simple question. About her work, in 3 years. Everett had, once, in 1998, when she had been trying to reupholster a footstool, and it had gone wrong, and he had come in and sat on the arm of the sofa and said, "Where's it going wrong? Show me." Iris was looking at her, with eyes that were not pitying, not curious in a hungry way, just patient. Margie took a breath. She opened her notebook. She turned it around. She pushed it across the table. "Here," she said, and Iris Kellner leaned forward, and she read. Iris found her the article, not immediately. It took Iris almost a month. Iris made phone calls to a university librarian she had gone to graduate school with. Iris ordered books on interlibrary loan. Iris photocopied journal articles at her own expense and stapled them together with a note that just said, "Try these." The article that changed everything was a photocopy of an old paper from 1972, a graduate thesis, 19 pages, bad photocopy quality. Half the diagrams were smudged, written by a master's student who had, based on Iris's follow-up call, been dead since 1994. The paper was about mineralized wood fiber blocks, which was fancy academic language. 4. Bricks made out of sawdust and lime and a little bit of cement. Margie read the paper 5 times. She sat at her table in the tent, with a kerosene lamp on, late into the night, and she read this dead graduate student's 47-year-old paper, until she could recite whole paragraphs of it out loud, from memory, because he had discovered, in 1972, what Margie had been trying to figure out on her own for 3 years. Sawdust alone, would rot. Sawdust mixed with clay would fail and freeze-thaw. But sawdust, mineralized, with a wash of lime water before you mixed it with clay, and a small amount of cement, that sawdust, would not rot, would not mold, would not crack in freezes, and would hold together well beyond her own lifetime. Margie read that line, and she put down the paper, and she looked out the tent flap at the night, and she said out loud, to nobody. So somebody already figured this out, and she felt a small, tired laugh come up out of her chest. She started buying lime, $2.49 a bag, broken bags, damaged sacks, from the farm store on Route 20, 6 miles out of town. She walked there. She bought a bag every other week. She saved wood ash from her fires. She scavenged small amounts of cement from the mill's back lot, where the drivers had spilled a bag once, or where a hardened chunk had been left behind after a foundation repair. She would pick up the chunks, take them back to camp, crush them with a hammer, filter the powder through a piece of window screen. By August of 2019, she had her ingredients. She made her first mineralized batch. She soaked the sawdust in a lime slurry for 24 hours. She let it drain. She mixed it with clay. She pressed her first stabilized brick. She numbered it with a nail scratch. On the bottom corner, B01 for batch 1. She started a new notebook. She wrote at the top of the first page, batch log, book 2. She capped her pencil. She looked at the little brick. She said out loud, very softly, "Let's see what you had." The dog came in the winter of 2020. The pandemic had shut everything down, which meant the diner had closed for 11 weeks, which meant Margie's income had dropped to almost nothing, which meant she was down to eating 1 meal a day. She got sick in early January. A fever, a cough, a weakness in her legs that made walking to the outhouse she had dug behind the tent feel like walking up a mountain. She did not go to the doctor, because she could not afford a doctor, because she was Marjorie Halstead. She lay in the tent for 3 days, drinking creek water she had boiled on a small propane camp stove Iris had left in a bag at the library. On the 3rd day, she thought she might die. She closed her eyes. She thought about the envelope, still in the pocket of the blue flannel shirt, in the cedar box, under her cot. She thought, if I die, nobody will ever open it. Nobody will ever know what he wrote. "Eva, what did you write?" She fell asleep. On the 4th morning, she woke to a sound. Scritch, scritch, something at the tent flap. She rolled onto her side, slowly. She reached out. She untied the tent flap. She pushed it open a few inches. A face was looking at her. A dog's face. Brown, skinny, ribs showing, one ear up, one ear folded down, muzzle streaked with gray, eyes that were the color of caramel. Wide, direct, looking straight at her. The dog did not move. Margie did not move. They looked at each other for a very long time. The dog was starving. The dog was cold. The dog was more or less exactly as bad off as Marjorie Halstead was. She whispered, "Hey." The dog's ear twitched. "Hey, dog." The dog stared at her. "You want to come in?" The dog did not move. Margie stared back. Her whole chest ached. Because, for 4 years, since Everett had died, nobody had looked at her like that. Nobody had made eye contact with her like that. Not Wendell, not Mrs. Whitcomb, not the woman at the food bank, not the cashier at the grocery, not even Iris. Not really. Not the way Everett used to look at her. Nobody had really seen her. And now a starving dog was staring straight into her face through a tent flap on a January morning at the end of the world. And she was. Margie reached down, very slowly, to the small tin of jerky she kept beside her cot for the very worst days. She opened it. She took out one strip. She held it out on the palm of her hand. The dog stepped forward. The dog took the jerky, very gently, not snatching, not lunging. The dog looked at her again. Margie held out the other strip. The dog took it. Margie held out her hand, empty, palm up. The dog sniffed her fingers. The dog stepped inside the tent and walked in a small, tight circle 3 times and lay down against her hip, under the blanket, as if he had been doing this his whole life. His body was warm. He sighed once, and he closed his eyes. Margie put her hand on his shoulder. She said out loud, "You're not staying." She said it again. "You are absolutely not staying." The dog did not open his eyes. She named him Bramble. Because he came out of the blackberry canes behind the tent. Because he had a burr matted into the fur behind his left ear that took her a full week to work out. Because, she thought later, he was full of thorns. But he had chosen her anyway. Bramble stayed. The pine resin came in the summer of 2021. Margie was 51 years old. She was pressing bricks at a rate of 20 a day. But one problem still would not go away. Water. Because Pacific Northwest rain does not fall, the way rain falls in other places. It hangs. It seeps. It stays on a wall for 8 straight weeks in November. And a wall that was 40% clay by volume would slowly weep. To soften, to dust off in flakes when you rubbed your finger across it, she wanted a wall that would outlive her by generations. On a hot morning in late June, Emmett Farkas came down the trail on foot, sweating, carrying 2 5-gallon buckets of something that looked like amber. He set the buckets down beside her wire ring. He said, "Miss Margie," she said. "Emmett," he said, "we got a problem up at the mill." She said, "Go on," he said. "You know Alden Thorne's been buying that beetle-killed lodgepole cheap out of Bend for the last 6 months. Well, that stuff bleeds pitch bad. Our blades gum up. Our chutes fill up. We got to shut the line down twice as stiff to clean off the resin." He kicked one of the buckets. It made a heavy sloshing sound. He said, "We're throwing about 10 gallons of this stuff out every single day. Alden won't let us haul it off proper. He says just dump it somewhere out back." He looked at her. He said, "I thought maybe you'd know somewhere to dump it." She stared at him. Then she stared at the buckets. Amber, thick, faintly translucent in the sun. Smelling like a Christmas tree lot in July. Turpentine, vanilla, something wilder, something ancient, pine resin, concentrated, basically distilled. Nature's oldest waterproofing agent. Margie stood very still, for a very long time. Emmett watched her face. He said, "Miss Margie." She did not answer. He said, "You're doing it again," she said, slowly. "Doing what?" he said. "That thing where you get quiet. And I know you just figured something out. That's going to keep me up nights." She looked at him. She said, "Emmett Farkas, leave the buckets." He said, "I figured," she said. "And when you dump tomorrow's 10 gallons, bring it here," he said. "I figured that too." He walked back up the trail. Whistling, Bramble watched him go. Margie sat down on her log. She looked at the buckets. She looked at the little pile of B-series bricks on the flat stone. She said, out loud, "Well, that changes everything." She did not sleep that night. She sat by lamplight in the tent, with her notebook open, sketching, calculating, testing ratios on paper. Sawdust, mineralized, 60%, clay, filtered, 25%, wood ash, 10%, pine resin, warmed to just below smoke point, 5%, poured in slow while mixing, to coat every particle, to bind every seam, to repel every drop of water for generations. She wrote at the top of the page, Formula H01, H for home, July 30, 2021. She capped her pencil. She looked at Bramble, asleep on the folded canvas at the foot of the cot. She said, out loud, Ev, I think I've got it. Bramble did not answer. But somewhere, Margie was almost sure her husband did. The foreman came down the trail in October of 2022, on foot, alone, with no dump truck, no drivers, no paperwork, just himself in his brown work jacket, holding his cap in his hands. Margie had been laying courses on the west wall of the tiny house that afternoon, which was almost half built by that point. Real walls, real window openings framed in salvaged fur, a doorway, a rough sketch of a chimney. She saw him coming. She did not stop working. Bramble stood up, from where he had been sleeping on a folded canvas by her feet. He watched Wendell approach. He did not growl, but he did not sit down again either. Wendell stopped about 10 feet away. He looked at the walls. He looked at Margie. He looked at his cap in his hands. Margie set down her trowel, wiped her hands on the front of her flannel shirt. She waited. Wendell cleared his throat. He said, Mrs. Halstead. She said, Mr. Brogan. He said, that's a good-looking wall. She said, thank you. Silence. Wendell shifted his weight. He looked at his cap some more. He looked at the creek. He looked at Bramble. He said, I owe you an apology. Margie did not answer. Wendell said, for 2016. Margie did not answer. Wendell said, I thought I was being clever. She looked at him for a long time. She said, you were being tired. He blinked at her. He said, how do you? She said, because I know what tired looks like, Mr. Brogan. I have been tired for 8 years. Wendell put his cap back on his head. He nodded. Once, he said. The loads, she said. What about them? He said. The drivers have been sorting them for a while now. She stared at him. He said, I told of them back in 18, 2 years in, when I saw what you were doing with them. I told them, drop the cleanest loads, the driest ones, closest to her forms. He looked at his boots. He said, I never told you, because. He shook his head. I don't know why I never told you. He looked up at her. His eyes were watery. His mouth was working strangely. Margie stood there in the smell of clay and pine, and she felt the door in her chest open a little further. She was not angry with him. That was the strange thing. She could not find the anger, because she understood him. He was a tired man, whose wife had left him, because he had grown quiet and bitter, and he had made a bad decision, and he had spent 2 years quietly trying to fix it, in the only way he knew how. She knew about that. She said, very quietly, Mr. Brogan? He looked at her. She said, thank you. He said, don't. She said, for 4 years of sawdust I did not have to fight for, because you told the boys where to drop it. Thank you. He turned his head away. She said, I'm sorry about Loretta, he said. How do you? She said, because Delia at the diner talks, same as everybody else. He gave a small, tired laugh. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. He said, I'm sorry about Everett. She said, thank you. They stood there as the fall light, beside a half-built house made of sawdust bricks that his mill had provided for 6 years because a woman he had wanted gone had refused to go. Bramble sat down, which meant, in Bramble's estimation, this man was not a threat. Wendell looked down at the dog. He said, you feed him. She said, he feeds himself, mostly. There's rabbits. Wendell reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out something wrapped in wax paper. He unwrapped it. It was a leftover ham sandwich. From the mill lunchroom, his lunch, that he had not eaten. He held it out to Bramble. Bramble looked at Margie. Margie nodded. Bramble took the sandwich, very politely. Wendell watched the dog eat, he said, without looking at Margie. I'll bring one every day. He turned. He walked back up the trail. He did not look back. That night, Margie lay into the tent, Bramble against her hip, Wendell's words in her ears. I told them, back in 18, I saw what you were doing with them, she thought. He knew. He watched. For 4 years, he watched me. He was helping me, and I did not know. And she felt something break loose in her chest, something that had been stuck for a very long time. She turned her face into Bramble's shoulder, and Marjorie Halstead, for the first time since 2 nights after her husband was buried, cried, really cried. The kind of crying that comes up out of a body from a very deep place. That takes the breath. That makes the shoulders shake. That has been waiting, patiently, for 7 years, for its turn. She cried for Everett. She cried for the white farmhouse. She cried for Mrs. Whitcomb turning her head. She cried for the first wall that dissolved in the rain. She cried for the dead graduate student whose paper had saved her life. She cried for Wendell Brogan, watching her from the mill office window since 2018 and never telling her because he did not know how. She cried for Bramble, who had walked out of the woods to find her. She cried for the woman she had been. She cried for the woman she was becoming. She cried until she had nothing left, until she fell asleep with her cheek wet against a dog's warm fur. When she woke, it was afternoon. Bramble was gone, probably out hunting. She sat up. She reached under the cot. She pulled out the cedar box. She opened it. She lifted the blue flannel shirt. She reached into the pocket. She took out the envelope. She held it in her lap. She looked at her name, written in Everett's shaky hand. She turned it over. She put it back in the pocket. She folded the shirt. She closed the cedar box. She was not ready yet, but she was closer. She was closer than she had ever been. The tiny house was finished in the spring of 2023. Foundation stones of creek rock and lime mortar. Set in October of 21. Level. Square. Set true or course by course. Waterproofed with pine resin. Bramble sitting on a boulder nearby. Roof rafters in the summer of 22. A whole bundle of perfectly good 2x6s appeared one morning on the woodpile, marked as reject stock, which they were not. Curtis Lundgren, the retired electrician, delivered them himself. He did not say a word about it. He just tipped his cap and drove away. A single small iron wood stove, which Delia Monroe's brother-in-law had pulled out of a cabin renovation on the coast, and which he brought up on a trailer on a Saturday afternoon, and which he refused to accept payment for. Because, he said, my sister-in-law would kill me. 4 windows, real glass, framed and set and puttied by Margie's own hands. Flower boxes under the front windows, filled with soil from her vegetable patch. Planted with nasturtium seeds Iris left in a paper bag at the library one afternoon in April, with a note for color. Margie moved in on the 11th of May, 2023. She was 53 years old. She had been living in the tent for 6 years and 9 months. The first night, she lay awake for hours. She said, out loud, to Everett, I did it. Everett did not answer. Bramble did. He rolled over. He put his warm, heavy head across her ankle. She fell asleep, smiling. Good year was 23, just that one middle year, when she had a house, and a garden, and a dog, and a diner shift twice a week, and a librarian who left her paper bags of good things at the front desk, and a foreman who now waved to her from the mill yard, and a routine, which is a thing a person only understands the value of after they have not had one for years. Bramble started to slow down that fall. She noticed it in September. He was slower on the walk to the creek. He would stop halfway. He would sit down. He would look at her, waiting for her to slow down too, which she did. He stopped hunting rabbits in October. He started sleeping more in November. In early December, on a Tuesday morning, she came out of the house, and Bramble was lying in his usual spot on the porch, curled up on the folded canvas. He did not lift his head. She knelt down. She put her hand on him. I was warm. He was breathing. But something was different. She sat with him on the porch all morning at around 3 in the afternoon. He lifted his head. He looked at her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her the very first morning, through the tent flap, direct, steady, caramel brown, full of a person. He looked at her, and then he laid his head back down, and he stopped breathing. Margie sat with her hand on him for another hour. Then she got up. She got the shovel from the shed. She dug a grave under the big leaf maple, beside the creek, where the shade was deepest in summer. She wrapped him in the folded canvas. She carried him herself. She laid him in the grave. She said out loud, you were the first one who saw me, Bramble. Then she cried. Not the same way she had cried on the night Wendell apologized. That had been a great river of grief breaking loose. This was quieter. This was the crying of a woman saying goodbye to a friend. She filled in the grave. She marked it with a river stone. She walked back to the house. She did not know, that night, that in exactly 19 days, a man in a brown suit and a badge that said County Process Server would come down that same trail and hand her a piece of paper that said vacate within 60 days. Alden Thorne had died in October of 2023. His grandchildren lived in Sacramento. They had never set foot in Pinebrook. By November, they had accepted a cash offer from an investment group out of Portland, a limited liability partnership called Cascadia Resource Holdings. The process server came on January the 3rd, 2024. His name tag said Harold. Harold did not want to be there. He handed Margie the paper. he said. I'm sorry, ma'am, Margie said. It's not your fault, Harold. She stood in the doorway of her house, in her flannel shirt, with the paper in her hand, and she watched Harold walk back up the trail. She closed the door. She read the paper. 60 days. Bulldozer scheduled for April the 8th. She sat down on the floor. Right there, in front of the door, she said, out loud. Well, she said. Ev, she said, this time I don't know what to do. Everett did not answer, but the house did. The house said, in the very quiet way that houses speak, to women who built them by hand, you built me once, you can build me again, somewhere else. Margie put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She was tired. She was so tired. She thought, I do not have another 6 years. I do not have another Bramble. She sat on the floor for a long time, then she got up. Because Marjorie Halstead got up. Because that is what Marjorie Halstead did. Wendell Brogan drove to the county planning office in Toledo the following Monday. He sat in a plastic chair for 4 hours. He said his piece. The supervisor was polite. The supervisor was sorry. The supervisor said the land had been sold. Wendell drove home in the dark. Delia Monroe circulated a petition at the diner. 231 signatures. She drove them to Toledo herself. She was told the petition would be taken under consideration, which meant thrown away. Curtis Lundgren wrote a letter to the editor of the Pinebrook Weekly Sentinel, which had a circulation of 840, which was not going to change anything, which he wrote anyway. None of it moved the bulldozer. Then, on a bright Thursday morning in the last week of January, a small silver car pulled up at the top of the logging road. A woman got out. She was 32 years old, dark hair pulled back in a bun, wearing a charcoal gray pantsuit and boots that were not made for mud. Carrying a leather folder under one arm, she looked down the trail. She started walking. She reached Margie's porch about 10 minutes later. Her boots were ruined. Margie opened the door. The young woman stood on the porch. She looked at Margie. She said, Mrs. Halstead, Margie said. Yes. The young woman said, you probably don't remember me. My name is Miriam Ostrander. Margie tilted her head. The young woman said, I was in your Sunday school class in the spring of 1997. I was 7 years old. It was my first Sunday. I had just moved to Pinebrook from Grants Pass. I did not know anybody. She swallowed. She said, you knelt down beside my chair on that first Sunday. You looked me in the eye and you said, hi, what's your name? She said, you are the reason I am a lawyer, Mrs. Halstead. Margie stared at her. Miriam said, I practice land use law in Eugene now. I read about you in the Sentinel last week, about the eviction. She held out the leather folder. She said, I'm here to represent you, free of charge. I owe you at least that much. Margie could not speak. She stepped back from the door. She said, come in, please, come in. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. Miriam took notes. Miriam asked questions Margie had never thought to ask herself. Miriam wrote down every date, every name, every year, every load of sawdust, every notebook. At the end, Miriam closed her folder. She said, Mrs. Halstead, adverse possession in Oregon requires 10 years of open, notorious, hostile, and continuous occupation. You are 8.5 years in. We may not win the land outright, but we can file a motion. We can delay the demolition. We can force Cascadia to negotiate. We can buy you time, she said. That's what I can do for you. Margie looked at the young woman across her kitchen table, and she saw the 7-year-old girl in the front row, with her hair in 2 braids, and her hands folded in her lap. On the first Sunday of April in 1997, Margie said, you remember all of that, Miriam said. I remember all of it, she said. You saw me, Mrs. Halstead, on a day when nobody else did. She said, it's my turn. Miriam filed the motion the next morning. The bulldozer was delayed. And that delay was what gave Iris Kellner time. To bring the paper bag, Iris came on a Thursday afternoon in the second week of February. She parked her old Subaru at the top of the trail. She walked down in her winter boots, carrying a paper bag. She knocked on the door. Margie opened it. Iris stood on the porch, her long dark braid over her shoulder, her chipped front tooth showing because she was doing something she did not do often, which was cry. Iris said, Miss Margie. Margie said, Iris, come inside. It's cold. They sat by the wood stove, Margie in the rocking chair, Iris on the cot. Iris put the paper bag on her lap. She said, I did something 9 months ago I did not ask you first. Margie said, Iris, what? Iris opened the paper bag. She pulled out a small stack of papers, held together with a clip. She held them across the small space between them. Margie took them. She read the top page. Oregon State University. Department of Materials Engineering. Laboratory Analysis Report. Submitted samples. 2 years. Cellulose cement composite. Approximate dimensions 14x7x5 inches. Submitted by Iris Kellner, Pinebrook Public Library. Margie looked up. Iris was crying silently, not moving. Iris said, I mailed him your bricks, Margie said. Who? Iris said, a Dr. Reuben Ashcroft at Oregon State, because I had read an article of his about sustainable building. Last spring, I took 2 bricks off your test wall, the 2 on the far left end. You had said you were happy with those, and I photocopied 50 pages of your notebook. When you were in the bathroom that day at the library, she stopped. She wiped her face. Iris said, the report came back 6 weeks ago. It said your blocks tested at strengths well above commercial standards. It said the formula appears to be a novel refinement of long-known composite techniques. It said the producer should be contacted. She said, I have been sitting on it, trying to decide when to tell you. Margie did not speak. Iris said, Miss Margie, I have to tell you something else. Margie looked up. Iris said, I did not just do this because of the bricks. Margie said, why did you do it? Iris took a breath. Iris said, my mother was homeless. When I was a little girl, she died on a bench in Tacoma, in the rain, when I was 12. Nobody knew her name. When they found her, nobody knew her name. She was crying openly now. She said, I saw you come into my library for 3 years before I said one word to you. And every time I thought about my mother, and I thought somebody has to see her, and it might as well be me. She said, I am sorry I did not ask you first. Margie set the report down on the arm of the rocking chair. She stood up. She walked across the tiny room. She knelt down in front of the cot. She took Iris Kellner's hands in her arthritic hands. She said, Iris Kellner. Iris looked at her. Margie said, your mother's name. Iris said, what? Margie said, tell me her name. Iris said, Rosalind Kellner. Margie said, Rosalind Kellner is not invisible right now in this room. Do you hear me? Rosalind Kellner is with us. Iris put her forehead against Margie's shoulder. The two of them stayed like that for a long time, beside a small wood stove, in a house made of sawdust and clay and pine resin, on a creek called Sparrow. The unseen, seeing the unseen. Dr. Reuben Ashcroft drove up from Corvallis the following week. Hal was 62 years old. He wore a beige jacket with elbow patches. He had a beard that was more salt than pepper. He walked around the tiny house for 2 hours. He rapped on walls. He measured window openings. He took coarse samples out of a corner. He asked to see the notebooks. Margie put all 11 of them on the kitchen shelf in a stack. Dr. Ashcroft turned the pages very slowly. At one point, he took off his glasses. He rubbed his eyes. He said, Mrs. Halstead. She said, yes. He said, you have, independently, redeveloped and significantly improved a branch of composite materials research that has been mostly abandoned since the 1970s, with no formal training, no lab equipment, and no funding. She said, I had a lot of time. He looked at her. He said, you had a lot more than time. 10 days later, the man in the gray suit came down the trail. His name was Harrison Vale. He was 51 years old. He was the founder of a small mission-driven company called Redwood Green Housing, based in Portland. 15 employees, focused on affordable low-carbon housing for rural and formerly homeless populations. He had been working on a composite block for 2 years. His engineers had solved half the problem. Margie's blocks had solved the other half. He stood on the porch. He set his briefcase on the porch step. He opened it. He handed her the folder, $500,000, for the tiny house itself, as their flagship demonstration model, for the 2 acres it sat on, which Cascadia Resource Holdings had suddenly discovered they were willing to sell at a very fair price. Now that Miriam Ostrander's motion had made the eviction complicated, and now that a certain reputational calculation had shifted overnight, and a licensing agreement for the formula and the curing process with her name on it, with royalties, Harrison Vale said. Mrs. Halstead. She did not take the folder. She said, I have conditions. He said, name them. She said, the formula is called Halstead Block. He said, that's what we assumed. She said, Halstead as in Everett Halstead. He said, your husband. She said, every product spec sheet, every technical document, every marketing brochure says Halstead Block, developed in memory of Everett Halstead, log truck driver, 1958 to 2015, Pinebrook, Oregon. Harrison Vale wrote it down in a small notebook. He said, "Done," she said. "Second condition," he said. "Please," she said, "you are not going to build 100 houses somewhere near Salem and put my name on them and take pictures." He said, "We were going to," she said. "You are not." He said, "What are we going to do?" She said, "You are going to fund something called the Halstead Circuit." He said, "The what?" She said, "A traveling training program. It goes to small Oregon towns. It takes 12 women per session, widows, middle-aged and up, women who have lost their homes, women who have arthritis, women who cannot start over, because starting over is for young people, and these women are not young." She stopped. She looked at him. She said, "You teach them the formula. You teach them the pressing. You teach them the curing. You teach them the construction. 8 weeks, room and board included, at the end. They know how to build a Halstead Block house from dirt with their own 2 hands, and you help them find a piece of land to do it on." Harrison Vale did not write. He looked at her. He said, "Who's going to teach it?" She said, "I am." He said, "Mrs. Halstead." She said, "Do we have a deal?" He said, "You are asking me to pay for a lifetime of program funding." She said, "I am asking you to pay for me being able to sleep at night for the rest of my life, knowing that other women are not sitting in tents, watching their friends walk past them in grocery aisles." Harrison Vale looked at the porch boards. He looked at the creek. He looked at the woman in the flannel shirt. He said, "Mrs. Halstead, we have a deal." She signed the papers on the porch in her careful old woman handwriting. Marjorie Louise Halstead. Harrison Vale put the papers back in his briefcase. He shook her hand, gently, because he had noticed her fingers. He walked back up the trail. Margie sat down in the rocking chair on the porch. She looked at the creek. She said, out loud, "Ev," she said, "I think it's time." She went inside. She took the cedar box off the mantel. She sat back down in the rocking chair on the porch. She opened the box. She lifted out the folded blue flannel shirt. She reached into the pocket. She took out the envelope. It was still white, slightly yellowed at the edges. 9 years old, her name in her husband's shaking hand. On the front, she held it in her lap. She listened to the creak. She said, "All right, Ev." She slid her thumb under the flap. She opened it. Inside was a single folded sheet of yellow legal pad paper. She unfolded it. She read. The handwriting was worse than she remembered. Very shaky, very small, written by a man whose hands had been dying. "My Margie, you are stronger than you know. You have always been seen. Even when I am gone, you are still seen. But the first person who has to see you is you. Don't wait for the world. Love, Ev." Margie held the paper in her lap for a very long time. She did not cry. She had done her crying. She just sat. She was seen. She had been seen the whole time. She had just needed to be the one to see it first. She folded the note. She put it back in the envelope. She put the envelope back in the pocket of the flannel shirt. She folded the shirt. She put the shirt back in the cedar box. She closed the box. She stood up. She walked to the porch railing. She looked at Sparrow Creek. She said, out loud, "All right, Margie, let's get to work." The first Halstead Circuit class started in Pinebrook on the 15th of April, 2024. 12 women, ages 46 to 68, referred by county social services offices across Western Oregon. Widows, divorcees, single mothers whose children had grown, women who had been sleeping in cars. Margie stood in front of them on the first morning, in a clearing beside the mill. Behind her, under a tarp, were the mixing tubs, the pressing molds, the lime bags, the buckets of pine resin. In front of her, 12 women, standing on the frost-hard ground. She said, "Good morning." They said, "Good morning," she said. "My name is Marjorie Halstead, but you can call me Margie," she said. 9 years ago, my husband died, and I lost my house, and I lived in a tent behind that mill up the hill. For 7 years, because I did not know what else to do," she said. "You are here because you also did not know what else to do," she said. "I'm going to teach you how to make a brick, and how to build a wall, and how to raise a roof, and how to make a home from nothing," she said. "But before I do that, I am going to teach you the most important thing I learned in those 9 years." She looked at them. She said, "You are still here." She turned to a woman in a red coat at the end of the line. Margie said, "Tell me your name." The woman said, "Denise, Denise Prather." Margie said, "Denise Prather, welcome home." She turned to the woman beside her. Margie said, "Your name." The woman said, Betty Coates, Margie said. Betty Coates, welcome home. She turned to a third woman. Small, gray hair, trembling hands. The woman said before Margie could ask. Louise Faraday, Margie said. Louise Faraday, welcome home. She stopped there. She let the silence hold. Then she looked at all 12 of them, and she said very quietly, you are seen, every one of you, right now, by me and by everyone standing here. And there was not a dry eye in that clearing, on that morning, in the foothills of the Oregon Coast Range. Margie clapped her hands once. She said, now, she said, let's make a brick. At the back of the clearing, standing behind the last row of women, was Mrs. Whitcomb. She had come alone. In her old Buick, she had not told anyone she was coming. She was 71 now. Her hair was completely white. She had read about the circuit in the Sentinel that morning. She had put on her coat, and she had driven out to the mill road, and she had walked down to the clearing, and she had stood at the back. She did not come forward. She did not say a word. She stood at the back, with her hands folded in front of her, and her eyes wet, and she watched Marjorie Halstead teach 12 women how to press a brick out of the raw materials of what a lumber town discards. When Margie looked up, their eyes met. Mrs. Whitcomb did not turn her head this time. She did not look away. She just stood there, and she nodded. Once, very small, and Margie nodded back. 20 years of friendship, and 8 years of turning away, and one small nod in a mill clearing. That was all. That was enough. Mrs. Whitcomb walked back up the trail, alone, to her old Buick, and she drove home. Margie kept teaching. Wendell Brogan retired that summer. At his retirement dinner, held in the mill's break room, the men gave him a gift, wrapped in brown paper. He opened it at the head table. Inside was a Halstead Block, honey gray, perfect, pressed by Margie herself, in the first circuit batch. Carved into one broad face of it, in her careful lettering, was one word: thanks. Wendell Brogan sat with the block in his lap for a very long time. He carried it home, in the passenger seat of his truck, belted in like a passenger. He set it on the kitchen counter of his empty house. He looked at it for a long time. Then he picked up the phone. He called his ex-wife Loretta. In Bend, he said. Loretta, it's Wendell, she said. Wendell, he said. I owe you an apology. About 12 years worth, she said. Well, she said, I've got time. If you've got time, he said. I've got time. They talked for 4 hours. That was not the end of that story, but it was a beginning. Margie still lives in the tiny house on Sparrow Creek. She teaches the circuit several times a year. Hundreds of women have come through the program. Dozens of houses have gone up, across small towns in Oregon and now spreading north into Washington and south into California. Every graduate of the program gets a hand-pressed Halstead block on the last day, with their own name carved into it, under the big leaf maple beside her creek. There are 3 markers now, one for Everett, one for Bramble, and one small wooden plaque, newer than the others, carved with these words: for every woman who was ever invisible. You are still here, sometimes on a summer evening. Margie sits in her rocking chair on the porch, with the cedar box on her lap, and she opens it, and she takes out the folded blue flannel shirt, and she puts her hand in the pocket, and she feels the envelope in there. She does not read the note again. She does not need to. She knows what it says. She knew what it said the whole time. She just needed 9 years, and a pile of sawdust, and a dead graduate student, and a young librarian with a lost mother, and a tired foreman with a lost wife, and a small brown dog, and a lawyer who had once been a 7-year-old in her Sunday school class. To finally believe it, she was seen. She had always been seen. She just had to be the one who saw it first. The sun goes down behind the ridge. The light on the water is gold. Sparrows make their evening noises in the alders, and a small silver-haired woman in a blue flannel shirt sits on a porch beside a creek, beside a tiny house made from what the world had thrown away. And she is home.